Thank you for joining us for this episode of Talking Health in the 406, where we're one community under the big sky. I'm your host, Jennifer Van Sickle, longtime healthcare worker turned health educator. In our state, the largest minorities are not Black or Hispanic populations, unlike much of our country. The largest minority are Native Americans. And if you did not grow up on a reservation or in a tribal community or even a tribal household, there's a lot you might not know, which is why I'm very excited to welcome our guest today, Amy Stiffarm. Amy is an Aani woman, and she shares a little bit of her life, from being raised in Harlem, Montana, to getting a PhD in Indigenous Health Studies from the University of North Dakota. This is one of the most fun and interesting podcasts I think we've done to date. You don't want to miss it. Again, thank you, Amy, for joining us for this podcast. We really appreciate it. And you've had a very interesting journey, and you've come a long ways, because I read about you in the newspaper back in, I think, April. And I remember thinking, whoa, we got to talk to this gal. And then interestingly enough, there you were at my daughter's soccer practice. And so it was like poetic that the universe just, boom, put you there with us. But I'm curious. So tell me about like your roots. Tell me about, where did you grow up at? Where did your story start, Amy?
Yeah, it's funny how things work like that. And I'm glad we got to meet. I grew up in Harlem. I'm from the Fort Belknap Indian community. Harlem is like 3 miles off the reservation, but that's where majority of the agency kids go to school. Fort Belknap is in north central Montana, and it's home to 2 tribes, the Aani or White Clay. We're federally recognized as Gros Ventre, but we prefer White Clay or Aani. And then the Nakota or Assiniboine people also live there. And we're 2 completely different tribes. Like, we don't really have any of the same, completely different language, different customs and all of that. Pretty separate in that way. But that's where I grew up. And then it's kind of interesting because I have I feel like my family and my connections are kind of like cast a wide net, because my paternal grandmother is from Rocky Boy. And when she married my grandpa, who was from Hayes, from Fort Belknap, they lived in Rocky Boy for a while. And my dad and his siblings grew up there until they were my dad was about middle school age, and my grandpa started working for the BIA.
BIA, is that Bureau of Indian?
Yep. He worked for, Bureau of Indian Affairs. And they have offices all over different reservations and whatnot. And so he went to work for them.
So that's a federal agency?
Yep. It's a federal agency. So my dad and siblings went to high school in Browning and have a lot of good friends there. And then on my mom's side of my family, her mother and family is from East Glacier. So they're Blackfeet. And then my grandma, kind of part of the relocation times, relocated to Missoula. And that's where my mom went to high school. So it's just kind of all over. Like, sometimes people would ask me, are you a Browning Stiffarm? And I'm like, no, that's not a thing. Stiffarms are from Fort Belknap, but not really realizing, that's what they would kind of refer to my family as like a Browning Stiffarm. So when my dad graduated from college and married my mom, they moved to Fort Belknap. And so that's where me and my 2 older brothers were raised.
And so I know in the article I read, they talked about, and forgive me if I pronounce it right, the Aani, that you were an Aani woman, I think was like the headline. And so do you, what do you identify as?
So yeah, the article said Aani, and technically I am Aani because that's where I'm enrolled. So there's this whole weird thing with blood quantum and whatnot now that's kind of controversial, but wherever you're enrolled at, like, that is your tribe. And for people, it's different though, because as far as culture goes, like, my grandpa who was Aani, he kind of stopped practicing traditional things. And I don't know why. There's like a lot of things where it wasn't talked about. No one sat me down and explained to me. I don't know why that happened, but my grandma on my Rocky Boy side was very traditional. She spoke Cree, and they did ceremony there. And so when I received like my ceremony name, it was in Rocky Boy. And then my dad and uncles participated in ceremony in Rocky Boy. Now that I'm older, I participate in ceremony in Rocky Boy. So like kind of culturally and like how we were raised, even we're more on the Chippewa Cree kind of side of traditions. And that, for growing up in Fort Belknap, there were things that were different about us. Like, for example, when somebody passes away, both Aani and Nakota tribes, they cut their hair. But that's not something that Chippewa Cree people do. And so I was always kind of confused too growing up, like, well, how come, do I have to do this? Like, asking all these questions. And we didn't then, older generations, I don't think really understood the importance or really understood like what was happening in this knowledge translation and this breakdown and how important our Indigenous knowledge would be and how much we would need it, especially for health and whatnot. So like something my dad always says, like now that I'm older, I'm kind of finding out the whys. And I'm like, well, how come you never told us that? And he's like, I didn't know what to tell you. And I didn't know what to ask my parents. Yeah, it gets a little tricky, but it's Aani. And I do say Aani like first, because that's where I grew up and that's where I'm enrolled at. But I also acknowledge my family from Rocky Boy and my Blackfeet side of my family, because it's, that I am them, that they are the reason why I am who I am. And so I just kind of think it's important to always acknowledge where you're from and where you came from, and not just to acknowledge them, but so people know who you are, especially when you're working in tribal communities, you want to be able to tell people who you are. And when I go to Browning, I'm still Bummy's girl or Barb's daughter, and so it's just a way that we connect.
That's awesome. And tell me about, if you can, about mentioned your ceremonial name.
A lot of tribes have ceremony names, our Indian names. It's really important for a lot of different tribes to have, or for people to have their name. Nowadays, it's been really great because people are giving their children, instead of English names, like names in their language, which I think is such a great strength and so important. And just to be, making non-Indigenous people learn their names and whatnot. I am not a very good Cree speaker at all, but I actually got my name from my namesake is my great aunt, but we call grandma. And my dad named me after her. So her name was Amy Chief Goes Out, Chief Stick. And when they named me Amy, she said, don't give her an Indian name. Like, I'm going to give her my name. Usually you get names pretty early when you're young, because part of it is they say when you go back to the stars, or go back when you pass away and you go to be with your ancestors, that they'll call you by your Indian name. And so it's important for people to have their names. I was a little bit older when I got my name, and she gave me her name. It like translates to goes with the bear spirit, but it's like there are different bear spirits, and this one, the bear spirit, is the black bear. Older names are really long, and so it's kind of one of them older names. But black bears are very human-like, and they were very respected for that, their ability to walk on two legs and kind of their human nature and their intelligence in that, just how they are and how they move, I guess, in this world. And so very, very respected and have a lot to do with healing. And so that was kind of, I think, a strength that I would pull on, especially when I was like thinking about applying to different schools and whatnot. I would think of that, like, oh, this is, I'm doing the right thing, or this is what I'm supposed to be, you have to give yourself those little pep talks. Like, my name, I think, really, grounded me in some moments. And actually, just this past summer, I was on a work trip in Browning on the Blackfeet Res. And, there was an elder there, Mary Ellen LaFramboise, and, we were eating lunch and she surprised me. We were at the Head Start, and we were learning about the cool things that they're doing and all the families they're serving. And they were talking about how, they used to have a program where the elders would come in and name the babies, and how important that was and how great that was. And here she surprised me. She had, Kevin Kicking Woman come in, and they gave me a Blackfeet name. It was one of the greatest honors, I feel like, because she, reminded me that I'm part of their community, that my parents are part of that community, and that, that they're proud of me and for getting my degree and for doing the work that I'm doing. And so now I have two names, which is common too. Like, people can have more than one name. So, Mountain Butterfly Woman is also my Blackfeet name.
Oh, that's fantastic. So now in certain circumstances, will you use both those names when you introduce yourself?
Sometimes I do, but also sometimes I'm ambivalent on that, because sometimes I feel like, yeah, I'm just going to say it. But other times I feel like, oh, this is just, this is for me and for ceremony and for family stuff. And I don't really, I don't know. My girls have their names. My oldest, they got named, in ceremony a couple summers ago. My oldest is, Yellowbird Girl, and my youngest is Sundance Girl. So we all know our names and know it's important.
You grew up in Harlem, and then after high school, did you leave Harlem? What was your course after that?
Looking back now, I was very much afraid of failure, and I was kind of paralyzed in fear. So I didn't really apply to college. My guidance counselor called me in my senior year and was like, why didn't you apply to college? So she was concerned. And so she sat down 3 applications in front of me. And she said I couldn't leave her office until I picked out one. And so I picked MSU Northern, because I kind of felt like I knew I would never go there, because it was Havre and my brother was there. And I'm like, oh, I'll never go to Northern, so I'm going to fill this out to get out of here. And after high school, I kind of was getting into trouble. I have nothing to do in a small town. And my mom and dad were like, you need to go to SKC. You're going to go and mostly because everywhere else was not, this was in the middle of the summer, and you can't just apply to college in the middle of the summer.
What's SKC?
Salish Kootenai College.
Where is that at?
It is on the Flathead Indian Reservation and in Pablo. So kind of at their agency headquarters. Thankfully, other people saw what I couldn't see. Even after I got in, the day before, I hadn't even packed anything. I didn't want to go. And my brother had to come and pack me up. He was so annoyed with me. I had one sock when I got there. I was like, oh, whoops. It was just a last second thing. And it was I was I don't want to go. And I remember my mom looking at me and being like, you're going. And it wasn't you're out of here. You can't live here anymore. But it was more of you deserve an education. You can do this. So my grandma lived in Polson, so I had a place to live. And so I always say my grandma was my college roommate. My mom and dad used to travel a lot when we were kids. So sometimes we would get to go, but a lot of times my grandma would ride the bus from Missoula and come and stay with us kids. So we were always really close. I had no idea what I was going to major in, which was one of my big reservations about going to college, is I don't know what I want to do. I have no idea. So that summer when I was home, I was still oh, I don't know if I want to go back, or, I'm just in liberal arts. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I kind of wanted to I thought if there was anything, it'd be around nutrition or whatnot, because had gone to as a kid, a lot of funerals back home. And like, we just like, that's just something you did. You showed up for other families and you would help in the kitchen. I would pass out food to elders and, just knew exactly what to do to go. As soon as you get there, you walk in and you ask like, who needs help, or you stay and you clean up, like there's just things that you do. I learned that, a lot of the deaths that occurred were preventable and like were from chronic disease. And so I'm like, oh, well, let's, it's about the food. Like I want to learn about nutrition. And SKC didn't have a nutrition department. After my first year, I was still kind of in this, like, I don't know what I want to do. And so I remember I printed everything out and I like put down all of these like associate degrees of like what I wanted to, like what I could do. And it was like education, nursing. And then like the science one kept coming up. And I was like I said, I was afraid of science, like, oh, this is going to be too hard. But when I would look up like what it would take to be a nutritionist, like you did have to have like a bachelor's in science and go on and get your master's in nutrition or dietetics. So I decided to do that. And I was really scared. Like I remember the first day of class, I was out in the parking lot and I was just like nervous. And I just remember, praying, like, open up my mind, like help me try to learn this. Help me. I know I was kind of like had this block. And a lot of times I think it was presented a lot in a way of like science being in direct opposition with culture and tradition and like our teachings and our stories. And so it kind of almost felt like it wasn't, you had to pick either or something. That was what my perception of it was. But at Salish Kootenai College, it's a tribal college. Every reservation in Montana has a tribal college. Not only they were made so people don't have to leave your community. SKC was a little bit different because they had a few programs that were really outstanding, like their nursing, environmental science, and they actually had bachelor degrees. They have a lot of bachelor. I think they now even have a master's degree in education. But anyways, I decided, I need to, I'm going to open up my mind and I'm going to just do my best. And so that year, I went in and I took a chemistry class from this woman from Barbados who like got her PhD when she was 21. And she was like amazing. Like she blew my mind. She was hardcore. Like we had a lot of homework, but she was very like, can do this. Like, this is like, you deserve to do this kind of, it was really empowering. I felt like, and I learned it. And at tribal colleges, especially in my experience at Salish Kootenai College, all the classes had to be grounded in culture, whether it was, an elective where it's an Indigenous language or even science. And so it always had to be connected to culture. And it was there when I started learning about things like Tylenol, like where different medicines, like where they actually come from, and how tribes would use willow bark. And then when you take that derivative, what's in that plant, would give you like Tylenol after it's been processed in the labs and whatnot. So it was kind of my first learning about Indigenous science and like about Indigenous people being scientists and about like science catching up to Indigenous knowledge through different experiences and or different experiments and whatnot, like, making medication and whatnot based on what Indigenous people would use when they were sick or when they were hurt. I ended up getting my associates. And at that time, like I said, there were other bachelor's degrees, but not in science. And I was looking at different schools like U of M, and MSU to continue on in science. And I didn't want to go to U of M because I looked at the price tag and I looked at the class size and I was like, I don't really want to do that. Like, I was like kind of scared, but I also felt like leaving the environment at SKC where there were like sometimes 6 students in a class, and I could go in and ask a question of my instructor, and they would like sit down with me and help me understand. There's just so much support, and the cultural aspect and being around your own people too, I think is important, or was important to me. And so the director of the program at the time said, listen, it's not accredited yet, but I'm pretty sure it is. But we have this 4-year life science degree. And it's supposed to be accredited next year in November. If it does, then you'll be the first one in the program. And so I decided to stick around, and sure enough, it got accredited. And I was like the first graduate of the life science program at SKC. And at that time, tribal colleges, they had a lot of like environmental science degrees and kind of around that realm, like wildlife biology, that kind of stuff. But this was really the first like molecular based science program out of any of the tribal colleges. And so through there, I was able to get more experience in the labs. We were doing research projects. We got to travel all over to different conferences and being able to present and present posters and oral. And like, I actually won. I started winning poster presentations. And so that like boosted my confidence and kind of helped me stay on track, and had to have good grades to be in the lab and to be working and to be going on these trips and whatnot. So that was a really big incentive for me. When I was a senior, I had some electives open. So I took issues in American Indian health through the nursing program. And that's when I really first started looking into stuff about like traditional birth and being interested in why there's not really much known about traditional birth and what birth is like.
So Amy, at that point, when you decided to go after that life science degree, had you kind of given up on the nutrition idea, or was that still going to be your launching point into the master's?
I was interested in health because of that class that I took. Knew I was interested in research, but I didn't really know what. So my advisor, or one of my professors at SKC, he hired me as the laboratory manager. And so I helped manage the lab, help students in the lab. But he was constantly bugging me about applying to graduate school. And so was my mom. So between the both of them, they drove me crazy enough that I applied to University of Montana School of Public Health, and I got in. So I started about a year after I graduated, I started that program.
To get to like the tribal college, can a non-Indigenous person attend school there?
Definitely. Okay. And I think that's the best thing about tribal colleges is, that's where you learn some like the federal Indian policies and what has really happened. And then you also get to learn, like I think about my nursing class, and there were non-Indigenous students there, and they were learning, not just nursing principles and how to be a nurse, but they were learning about, like, that was a required course for them. They had to learn about caring for Indigenous people, and you had to take cultural electives. So you had to learn about Indigenous culture. And I think that's like only fair. We've had to learn all of this Western science, and all of our education is from, a Eurocentric mindset. And so at a tribal college, yes, you learn the scientific methods and all of that, but I also learned about culture. And so for Indigenous people, it's so important, I think, if you're going to work with tribal communities, to have that background. So, and that's going to be so much better for them when they're working in tribal communities, but even more important, it's going to be better for the tribal communities that they're serving.
Well, and it's interesting because, Native Americans are our largest minority in the state of Montana. And I think there's a lot of want. I don't know if it's me personally, but I think there's a lot of want to know, because now how do we reach into these communities and help more, like with chronic diseases? I feel like I see it in my day job. How do we help more? How do we, diabetes, tons of it in tribal communities. We're trying to stem the tide everywhere in the US. How do we help? What do we do? And same with diabetes prevention, and different approaches are needed, maybe getting back to exactly like you talked about with nutrition. And instead of promoting, let's use fake sugar, hey, let's go out and, maybe it is these roots instead that we need to be using, or these berries off the trees, and that would be more accepted. But I feel like there is a lot of unsurety in so many aspects of life, because there's unknowns, even just going, I saw you at the powwow and this last weekend, and I posted videos on my Facebook page, and I think I had 6 comments of, oh my God, that would be so awesome. I've always wanted to go to one of those. But there's this fear of like, I'm not Indigenous. Is it okay for me to even go? Yeah. A lack of knowledge, which therefore brings unsurety on how to proceed and how to go, and so I think that's awesome that I'm sitting here. I'm still a few years from college for my oldest, and I'm sitting here thinking, I think I'm going to add tribal colleges to the list, because this would be fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. And then even like virtual options too. Like I'm a big proponent of that when I give presentations and stuff. I'm like, every reservation has a tribal college in the state. We are so incredibly lucky to have that. And so like, what if, like, I don't think it's too big of a stretch for people to consider, taking a class, like looking and seeing if there are any courses that you could take online, and even looking at their libraries to see what kind of books they're recommending. I think there's a really good place. They're great for Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people too. And about the powwow thing, it's funny because we were just talking about this on a call of, people living in Missoula and not realizing they could go to Kiayo. And I think for the most part, if you weren't supposed to be there, you wouldn't hear about it, like they're like ceremonies and that's very much like within the community and pretty private for the most part, not somewhere where like a non-community member would just show up. But it'd be hard to find out about anyway, like if you didn't know about it. But powwows, they're advertised and they're out in the community. If you see a flyer for an event, like a powwow, it's because they want the community to go. And, I will say like, that's so important for like, as a Native person, and who a lot of my teachers were non-Native, a lot of the folks at Indian Health Service were non-Native. Like we remembered the ones who came to our stuff, the ones who came out there. It was important to us. And I don't think we could like explain that to somebody like at being a kid, but it made me feel more comfortable with somebody to know that there wasn't an us and them kind of feeling, or, like they were, they supported, come watch me play basketball, but come watch me dance at the powwow too. I think like a lot of times if it's advertised, you can totally go. And especially if you have, like our daughters play on the soccer team. And so, she got to watch my daughter dance, and, like that's building relationships, and that's building trust. And that's showing your daughter or our daughters that people are different and come from different backgrounds, but that they can still, that they're still could be friends, and they still are a team. And, I think that's important. And even like to go a step further, if you are somebody who has funding or, how to help, the solutions are in the communities. And when I was getting my graduate degree, I kind of felt like the vibe was, let's learn about all these bad things. Like, let's try to learn, and let's try to help, or let's try this, let's try that. But now, after finishing my PhD and in that program, it's very much like, what are the strengths already in the community, and what can we, when we're talking about like diabetes, like what's already worked, what has already been sustaining well-being in tribal communities, what was there before settler colonialism came and caused all this disruption in health, our traditional practices and our traditional foods. And so, an outsider or an outside researcher or an outside health organization isn't going to know that. And so they need to be really intentional about investing in the community, sharing the resources, and bringing in Indigenous folks to lead projects and to help, number one, decide what issue they want to address, but two, how they want to address it. So I'd say those are those are some really big things that I think people are still learning. It's kind of like, well, how can we help? And education is important in that, finding out like, what is the real history of the United States? What are the federal Indian policies that were enacted to, first exterminate, then assimilate Indigenous people, and how does that impact us today? There are things that aren't ancient history that still are affecting people, and it's there. It shows in our health statistics and in these high rates of things like diabetes and mental health disparities, all of that. And you can trace those back to the history of what happened to Indigenous people as the United States was being created. And so, I think it is scary, but there are places to start now, especially like the tribal college. Just learning, I think, is a great place to start. When I started my job, before I started working for them, like full time as an employee, they hired me on contract because they wanted to do stuff in tribal communities, but none of them were Native. And they said, this is not us. Like we have the funding and we would much rather hire an Indigenous person to lead this work. Not like, hey, come be on our project and be on our poster so people will trust us. But they valued like Indigenous ways of knowing and ways of being enough to understand that it's not them. Like we'll hire an Indigenous person to lead this project. And so that was how I first started working with the organization I'm at right now. And I think more people need to do that.
So you finally got the courage to go to U of M. You finally left your tribal Indigenous population and actually moved to Missoula and went to school?
Well, I didn't have to move. It was an online program.
Okay.
But I was officially in classes where, I would be like the only Native sometimes. Mm-hmm. So, that was hard. And I remember kind of feeling like, I'm not going to bring up Native issues. Like, I'm not going to bring up anything. Like, I don't want to have to go and explain things. And I don't think that lasted very long because it was always just in my nature to, if we're learning about, one of the first classes I took was maternal child health. And so if we're learning about a certain issue like gestational diabetes, then it was always in my nature to go and find the additional information that was specific to tribal communities and Native American populations. So I was kind of doing like all of that extra work. And so when I was in my graduate degree, that's when I had my daughters. I had my oldest. That was when I really got inspired and interested in lactation rates and breastfeeding and all of that. I was scared. My baby was like a day old. Like, I'm not doing it right. I don't know if I'm doing it right. It was kind of a mess. And I called down to the public health department, and like within 2 hours, somebody was at my door and they were like showing me the different positions, and they were literally like, no, you're doing it. Like, you're fine. And then after that, I was like, I knew that nothing was wrong. Like, I was doing it and she was getting enough food. And so that after that, like, there were no more issues. Well, I went home to Fort Belknap and my cousin had a baby shower for me. She was like, oh, we just got back from Great Falls. She had just had a baby and she had breastfed. This was her third baby and she breastfed all her babies. And her third baby was having issues with like a tongue tie, and they were like driving to Great Falls or like going back and forth. And I realized that in Fort Belknap, there was only one certified lactation consultant for the whole reservation. And they were also like the WIC lady. And so she didn't have that. She couldn't have someone come up to her house where she was like postpartum, and she didn't get that support. So I started looking, I remember hearing like Native American breastfeeding rates are low. So I started kind of like looking into that, and nobody was really talking about that part, about like the rurality of it and not having those kind of supports. Like, it was just like that it was low and we need to do everything we can to increase these breastfeeding rates or something. But it wasn't talking about the why. In my research on breastfeeding, I got introduced to Cami Goldhammer's work, and she was a social worker who IBCLC, so it's like International Breastfeeding Lactation Consultant, certified lactation consultant. She was the first one who I ever remember linking low breastfeeding rates to assimilation efforts like boarding schools. And so she talked about how, well, let's think about this, right? Let's go back a few generations. And, when you remove children from the family unit, from the community, and you place them in these institutions without any of their family, or, they're all kids except for the adults, like no one's there, taking care of babies or having babies. They don't get to see how their parents took care of their sibling. How did their parents feed their siblings when they were born? Of course, we have low breastfeeding rates when you think about it that way. And so she also talked a lot about really strong points of promoting breastfeeding in Indigenous communities. And one thing that she would say is like, breastfeeding or lactation is food sovereignty. And when we think of like our first foods and we're thinking of food sovereignty, milk medicine is very much a part of that.
You've got my wheels are turning here. I mean, yeah, on so many aspects. It's fantastic. And the breastfeeding, with my own personal experience, massive amount of guilt. I remember struggling. I remember being in tears and working so many years in ultrasound. I remember I would literally give patients a box of sample of formula, and I would say, do not feel guilty. Fed is best. This idea, the milk medicine, maybe would help with that guilt, would help where, like, to me, that just feels better in my brain. Even as a non-Indigenous person, for that. And if it would help that guilt, and if it would help the messaging, not only in tribal populations, but everywhere, but all across Montana.
Yeah. And I think that's a big thing too. Like as learning about that and becoming a big advocate, for breastfeeding and whatnot, it was always about helping people, making sure like I wasn't ever blaming one person for, I know so much about the odds and all of these things that like can go wrong. And, it's more about like helping the systems, setting people up for success, and not, definitely not shaming anybody, but being supportive and coming back to some communities who, because of assimilation efforts and, they call it epistemicide, or, this destroying of traditional knowledge that happened, coming back to communities that weren't aware of, the importance or that kind of first food teaching of milk medicine, and not really being as supportive of, and even making it harder, like being like making people feel like they had to be modest, or like it was not modest to like feed your baby whenever they were hungry. And so there were a lot of like other barriers, like systematic barriers that, Cammie's work and, kind of how she teaches about helping and being, she's like a shiro for maternal child health for Indigenous people, but it was always about the systems. It was never, it was like helping the mothers who wanted it, or birthing people who wanted it. And not, it was never about like shaming anybody, but just helping people be aware of the systematic barriers and looking at ways to improve those.
Absolutely. And I can see where change is definitely needed. We're going to take a pause right there in Amy's story, but don't worry, she's back in our next episode. And on behalf of myself and the podcast team behind the scenes, we want to thank Amy for sharing her story with us and spending time with you today as well. If you would like any information on what you heard today, visit our website at talkinghealthinthe406.mt.gov. Until next time, take care.